Zsolt Darvas, in your most recent policy contribution, co-written with Erhi Vihriala, you argue that the Council's country-specific recommendations perhaps don't reflect their overall euro area recommendations. Where do you see the mismatch?
Yes, the recommendations for the euro area very much reflect the general policy view of the European Commission, whereby they pay very strong emphasis on structural reforms, and indeed those parts of the recommendations which are related to structural reforms are very comprehensive. But on the other hand, they made a number of recommendations for the euro area aggregate which are not properly reflected in country-specific recommendations. Let me tell you three examples. One is on fiscal policy. They argue that there should be a proper aggregate fiscal stance for the euro area as a whole, but this is not really reflected in country-specific recommendations. The second one is intra-euro adjustment, whereby they emphasize in the euro area report the need for adjusting both current account deficits and surpluses, but in the country-specific recommendations, for example, for Germany and Netherlands, they do not even mention that these countries have record high current account surpluses. And the third one, that the euro area recommendation very rightly place a strong emphasis on financial reform, completing the banking union, recapitalizing banks, and so on. But again, these are largely missing from the country-specific recommendations.
What are some examples you can give us?
For Germany, a country which has largely overperformed the requirements, for example, both in the European legislation, now we have fiscal rules, and Germany did much more than what was needed. Also, Germany has an own debt break rule, and again, the federal government consolidated much faster than it was needed. And I mean, for Germany, the only suggestion that it should maintain its sound fiscal position at a time when in the euro area as a whole there is a very weak aggregate demand, and in Germany in particular, public investment is very low, one of the lowest in the euro area, but also private investment is very low. And there was no suggestion for Germany to try to boost investments in the country.
So how well do you think the country-specific recommendations reflect overall euro area recommendations in terms of external imbalances and adjusting surpluses and deficits?
External imbalances are one of the major problems in the euro area, whereby before the crisis there was a massive capital flow, let's say from Germany and other stronger countries to Southern Europe, and these countries accumulated very large external debts. Now this has to be corrected because certainly such a high external debts cannot be sustained, and the adjustment is the easiest when both the surplus and the deficit countries adjust, whereby the surplus countries increase their demand and thereby reduce their surpluses, and the deficit countries certainly cut their domestic demand. They have no choice. They make themselves more competitive, and thereby they can export more and improve their external position. But unfortunately, in the country-specific recommendations, the suggestions are very much one-sided. It is mainly for the deficit countries which are required to adjust. By, for example, for Germany, very limited adjustment have been made. Let me, for example, read one of the Council suggestions for Germany. I have here the document, which says, for example, that Germany should sustain conditions that enable wage growth to support domestic demand. But in the rest of the paragraph, they are saying that, for example, a major means through which this should happen is increasing the educational achievement of disadvantaged people, which is a very important goal. I very much agree, but I don't think that it can contribute much to wage adjustment. And also the rest of the paragraph basically talks about improving the labor market in Germany, integrating the unemployed, and so on. But again, in Germany, the employment rate is the second highest in the euro area, and the unemployment rate at 5% is one of the lowest.
So given that suggests the euro area recommendations lack real teeth, does that make a strong case for the setup of a federal fiscal authority?
Indeed, if you look at what happened in the past 3 years in the euro area, then there was a very strong fiscal tightening at a time when the cyclical position of the economy weakened very significantly. Unemployment increased almost everywhere, except perhaps Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg. Even in the Netherlands, unemployment rate started to increase. So the fiscal stance in the euro area as a whole was not consistent with the deteriorating economic situation. Now, nobody calls for, and we also do not call for, these so-called old debt-making policies. And in Southern Europe, where they had countries had very high public debts and large budget deficits, there was no choice but to do a fiscal consolidation. I very much agree. But I disagree that it was also necessary at least at such a pace in Germany and in other countries which have strong fundamentals. Now, if there was a euro area level fiscal authority, then it could have considered much more the needs of the euro area, and it could have helped to smooth regional shocks. Now the shock is in Southern Europe. Maybe in 5 years from now, the shock will be in Germany.
So what does that tell us about looking and analyzing the euro area economy as a whole, given there's clear signs of fragmentation?
Certainly, the single monetary policy and the single currency ties these countries together very much. But on the other hand, even irrespective of the crisis, there are major fragmentations to the single market. For example, in the services markets, there are major fragmentations. And also with the crisis, financial markets became much more fragmented, whereby banks reduced very significantly their cross-border exposures. But if you look at, let's say, the economic developments across the euro area, we see extremely diverse developments. For example, the unemployment rate is about 5% in Germany and Austria, but 26-28% in Greece and Spain. So there are clearly major differences inside the euro area. So we cannot say that there is one single economy, and therefore the monetary policy will fit the needs of all of the member states.